Jacob always had a relatively peaceful routine as a taxi driver. For him, the job was more than just about making money. It was a way to escape monotony and connect with different people. He enjoyed the casual conversations with passengers, as each ride offered a brief new perspective on life. His medium-sized town, located in the interior of the United States, wasn't exactly bustling, which allowed him to avoid heavy traffic, making the job even more enjoyable. Over the years, Jacob transitioned from a hired driver to someone who owned his own vehicle. This was a significant milestone, as it not only increased his independence, but also gave him the freedom to set his own hours. He started working for himself, renting a taxi license, and paying a weekly fee. The freedom that the job provided was one of the things Jacob appreciated the most. Despite his passion for the job, Jacob also faced difficulties. He was divorced and needed to ensure that his son, who at the time was only 8 years old, was well taken care of. The money he earned as a driver wasn't much, but it was enough to cover basic expenses. He wasn't a demanding man. He bought only the essentials with no major luxuries. Even after the divorce, Jacob maintained a good relationship with his son, though he knew life wasn't easy. He had grown accustomed to loneliness, but the emptiness he often felt was offset by his daily interactions with passengers. The small human contact helped him cope with his new reality. Still, the silence at home was deep when he returned after work. Jacob led a simple life where small details mattered. He had a well-established routine and rarely deviated from it. The town he knew like the back of his hand was, to him, a safe place without major surprises. Up to that point, everything in his life seemed calm, until the day an unusual proposal arose, completely changing his perception of what he considered normal. Though taxi driving seemed like a peaceful job, it was about to lead Jacob into a world of dark secrets and disturbing experiences. What he didn't know was that by accepting a seemingly innocent offer, he would cross a line that would bring him face to face with the inexplicable. One day, while Jacob was at the taxi stand, a colleague, Mark, approached him with an unusual proposal. He seemed both anxious and intrigued, which piqued Jacob's curiosity. The colleague mentioned that a local bar was looking for a private driver, especially for nights. While it was something different from Jacob's usual routine, the offer seemed simple: work exclusively for the bar, transporting clients and staff. Jacob was initially skeptical. The bar in question wasn't exactly a traditional bar. It was known as a rendezvous house, frequented by men looking to relax with the workers there. The idea of being the driver for such an establishment made Jacob laugh, amused by the thought of chauffeuring that kind of clientele. However, the offer had its merits, especially as it promised extra income. The reason Mark hadn't accepted the offer was quickly explained. He was married, and his wife would never agree to that kind of job, especially at night in a place like that. Mark trusted Jacob and believed he would be the right person for the job. After thinking about it, Jacob realized that, being divorced, he had no ties preventing him from accepting the proposal. It was an opportunity to increase his income without major complications. Curiosity got the better of him, and Jacob decided to contact Nate, the bar's owner. The meeting was arranged for later that same afternoon. Nate was a young man, just 30 years old, which surprised Jacob. He had expected someone older, but Nate turned out to be a determined and self-assured entrepreneur. He explained the bar's concept and the growing demand for transportation in the early morning hours, especially due to its remote location outside the city center. Nate's proposed deal was interesting. He didn't need a conventional taxi, but a discreet vehicle that wouldn't attract attention from nosy people. The rides would mostly be for clients and workers, and the pay was good. Jacob thought it over, and the extra income, which he desperately needed, seemed an irresistible advantage. In addition, the prospect of working flexible hours appealed to him. Even without being absolutely sure, Jacob ended up accepting the offer that same afternoon. What he didn't yet know was that this job would lead him into situations far beyond anything he could have imagined. The quiet nights when he drove his taxi to the bar would soon transform into dark and unsettling journeys. Mr. Bruno entered Jacob's life discreetly, but quickly became a central figure in his experiences as the bar's driver. He was a regular customer, a man around 50, who, at first glance, didn't seem any different from the other patrons. However, There was something about Mr. Bruno that sparked curiosity and, eventually, fear. Mr. Bruno was known for being a friend of the bar owner and for his great generosity, especially with the workers. He had a favorite, though he never made it completely explicit. Always well-dressed, with an imposing appearance, the man seemed accustomed to luxury. His presence was shrouded in mystery, and the workers often mentioned him, though rarely in a positive light. What truly set Mr. Bruno apart were the rumors surrounding him. It was whispered that the man had made a pact with supernatural forces. The bar's women told stories about how he seemed untouched by time, and how his fortune seemed inexhaustible, no matter the circumstances. No one knew exactly where his wealth came from or what his past was, but everyone agreed there was something strange about him. Jacob, however, had a different first impression. On the rides he made to take Mr. Bruno to his rural property, the man seemed friendly and extremely simple. He talked about his land and cattle as if he were just another farmer. Mr. Bruno's house, however, told a different story. It was large, modern, and luxurious, suggesting he had much more than just a rural life. As time went on, the relationship between Jacob and Mr. Bruno grew closer, with the driver regularly taking the man to his isolated property. Each time Jacob accepted a new ride to the farm, he was filled with a mix of curiosity and apprehension. Even with all the rumors, Jacob had never witnessed anything abnormal about Mr. Bruno until the paranormal events began to occur. Mr. Bruno, with his enigmatic aura and unsettling calm, gradually revealed himself to be a central figure in the spiral of supernatural events surrounding Jacob. The more involved Jacob became with this client, the deeper he found himself immersed in a world of secrets and forces beyond his comprehension. The first time Jacob was assigned to drive Mr. Bruno to his farm, he felt a slight unease. The mountainous region where the farm was located was known to be dangerous at night. Additionally, the hour-long drive made Jacob anxious, as it involved dark and lonely roads. However, what made him proceed was Nate's insistence, who assured him that Mr. Bruno was a rich and generous man. During the trip, Mr. Bruno was very polite and friendly, easing some of Jacob's initial concerns. The man talked a lot about his land, his cattle, and his life in the countryside, as if there were nothing extraordinary about him. As Jacob listened to these stories, he began to feel more at ease, despite the darkness of the road. When they arrived at their destination, Jacob was surprised by the grandeur of the property. Mr. Bruno's farm was a true fortress in the mountains. The house was huge, modern, and equipped with all the luxury one could imagine. Jacob didn't enter the house, but the facade alone was enough to impress him. It was evident that Mr. Bruno had far more than just a few acres of land and cattle. That night, Mr. Bruno left a generous tip for Jacob, who returned home satisfied, though intrigued by what he had seen. That first ride seemed normal, but something about the place's atmosphere made Jacob uncomfortable. The stories he'd heard at the bar about Mr. Bruno started to make more sense. He began to wonder if the man, who seemed so simple and kind, really had something sinister in his life. However, Jacob tried to ignore the rumors and focused only on the generous pay he received for each ride. Over time, Jacob became accustomed to driving to Mr. Bruno's farm. Each time he drove him, the sense of discomfort grew, but he tried to push these feelings aside, rationalizing that it was just the lonely and dark nature of the place. However, everything changed on the third trip to the farm, when Jacob witnessed something he would never forget. At that moment, Jacob didn't yet know what lay ahead. The farm, Mr. Bruno, and the rumors began to intertwine in his mind, but he was still reluctant to believe that anything supernatural was involved. However, the events that followed would make him reconsider everything he thought he knew about the world around him. Stories about Mr. Bruno circulated among the bar's workers and frequent customers, creating an aura of mystery around him. Most people said the man had made a pact with the devil, which explained his fortune, his youthful appearance, and the automatic respect everyone had for him. Jacob heard these rumors with some skepticism, but over time he began to notice something strange in Mr. Bruno's interactions with others. The workers in particular had strange stories about their experiences with Mr. Bruno. Some said that after a night with him, they felt a sinister presence around them for days. Others reported that there was a dense energy in his house, as if something was watching them the whole time. Still, many of them continued to attend to Mr. Bruno, because of the generous tips he left and the fact that he never treated them badly. The most common rumor was that Mr. Bruno had some sort of supernatural protection. People at the bar talked about shadows that followed him, and there were even those who swore they had seen him talking to himself at certain moments. Despite all this, Mr. Bruno's behavior never changed. He always appeared smiling, polite, and willing to spend money on his friends and the workers. This only deepened the mystery, as no one could reconcile his friendly nature with the sinister stories. One of the most bizarre stories was that Mr. Bruno could manipulate events around him, making himself untouchable by forces that would harm anyone else. Some said fatal accidents had occurred near his property, but he always came out unscathed, fueling the belief that he had made some kind of pact. This kind of rumor created an environment of fear and fascination around him. Jacob, despite hearing these rumors repeatedly, never witnessed anything that could confirm such claims. Mr. Bruno always behaved normally on their rides, and the only things that seemed out of the ordinary were the vastness of his property and his apparent wealth. However, as Jacob spent more time at the bar, he began to notice the nervousness of some workers when Mr. Bruno's name was mentioned. It was only after his supernatural experience on the road that Jacob began to believe that perhaps there was some truth to the rumors. Mr. Bruno's strange behavior, his calmness in the face of frightening events, and the way he always seemed one step ahead of the fear he provoked in others, raised suspicions. From that point on, Jacob began to see Mr. Bruno in a new light. Everything started on the third time Jacob was assigned to drive Mr. Bruno back to his farm. This time, however, he wasn't alone. Mr. Bruno was accompanied by a young worker from the bar, Emily. The mood in the car was relaxed at first, with Mr. Bruno and Emily exchanging laughs and casual conversation, but soon everything would change. Jacob followed the usual route, turning onto a dirt road that led to the farm. During the ride, Emily, apparently under the influence of alcohol, asked Mr. Bruno about the rumors circulating about him. She wanted to know if it was true that he had made a pact with the devil. Mr. Bruno, laughing, neither confirmed nor denied it, but answered enigmatically, hinting that there were things people would never understand. The tension in the car increased when Mr. Bruno, jokingly, asked if Emily wanted to see something supernatural. It was then that Mr. Bruno asked Jacob to stop the car. Reluctantly, Jacob obeyed. He thought it was just a joke between the client and the worker, but something in Mr. Bruno's tone made him uneasy. The car stopped in a dark stretch of road, surrounded only by trees and silence. Suddenly, a sound like someone tapping on Jacob's window echoed through the night. Jacob looked around, but saw no one. Emily laughed, saying it was probably Jacob playing a trick, but he knew that wasn't the case. Moments later, the sound repeated on the other side of the car, this time louder. Jacob felt a shiver run down his spine. He looked again and saw nothing but the darkness of the road. When he thought the worst was over, something struck the back of the car forcefully, causing the vehicle to shake. The tension in the car reached its peak when Jacob finally looked ahead and saw a figure standing in the middle of the road. The being was wearing green clothing, similar to that of St. Jude Thaddeus, but its face was grotesquely deformed, like a macabre caricature of a sacred image. Jacob felt terror take over his body, his hands trembling on the steering wheel and sweat running down his forehead. The creature stared at him, with drooping eyes and a disturbingly open mouth. Before Jacob could react, Mr. Bruno, with unsettling calmness, told him to keep driving. Shaking, Jacob hesitated for a moment, but when he looked again, the figure had disappeared. He put the car into gear and continued on his way, trying to make sense of what he had just witnessed. The silence in the car was oppressive, and the feeling that something supernatural was happening took hold of Jacob. From that night on, he would never see the world the same way again. After the terrifying experience on the road, Jacob was deeply shaken. He returned home that night in a state of shock, feeling a fear he had never experienced before. The silence in his house, which had once been a relief after long hours of work, now seemed oppressive, almost threatening. He barely managed to sleep, and when he finally did, he had vivid nightmares of the deformed face of the figure he had seen on the road. In the days that followed, Jacob began to feel like he was being watched, as if the presence he had witnessed on the road was following him. He avoided being alone for too long, and when he was home, he left all the lights on. The image of the figure of St. Jude Thaddeus, with the distorted face, was etched into his mind, and he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The terror wouldn't leave him alone. At work, Jacob began to behave differently. His colleagues noticed he was quieter and more distant. He avoided talking about the experience, fearing that by recounting what he had seen, it would somehow become more real. Additionally, there was the feeling that by talking about it, he might attract the presence again. For him, silence seemed like a form of self-protection. Despite all his efforts to avoid remembering that night on the road, Jacob began to have visual and auditory hallucinations. Often, while driving, he would see shadows passing out of the corner of his eye. At times, he heard distant voices, as if someone were whispering in his ear. The stress and fear began to take a toll on his physical health, and Jacob started losing weight and having trouble concentrating. The psychological impact of the experience was so profound that Jacob began to question his own sanity. He wondered if what he had seen was real or if his mind was playing tricks on him. However, whenever he tried to convince himself that it was all just an illusion, he remembered Mr. Bruno's calmness during the situation, which only increased his suspicions that something truly supernatural was happening. Over time, Jacob began to dread the idea of returning to Mr. Bruno's farm. The man, who had once seemed like a friendly and kind figure, now carried a weight of mystery that Jacob wasn't prepared to face again. He knew that eventually he would have to return to that road, but the fear of what he might encounter kept him in a constant state of alert and anxiety. After the supernatural experience, Mr. Bruno, as if he knew exactly what Jacob had gone through, handed him a small frame of red fabric. That object, according to Mr. Bruno, would serve as protection against what Jacob had seen. The small, seemingly insignificant frame carried enormous weight, especially when given with the seriousness with which Mr. Bruno presented it. The man's confidence that it would work was both reassuring and unsettling. Jacob remained silent as he received the object. He didn't know exactly how to react, but he accepted the frame with trembling hands. Mr. Bruno's words, "Don't show fear," echoed in his mind. According to Mr. Bruno, the being that Jacob had seen fed on people's fear, and it was essential that Jacob remain calm and not show vulnerability. These instructions, however, were much easier said than done. In the days that followed, Jacob kept the frame close to him at all times. He would put it in his pocket when he left the house and kept it by his bedside while he slept. Still, the signs that something was wrong continued to torment him. He heard inexplicable sounds in his house, like footsteps and low voices, and felt a constant presence around him. Jacob tried to convince himself that Mr. Bruno's object would keep him safe, but the fear was hard to ignore. One night, while driving back home, Jacob felt a presence in the back seat of the car. The fabric frame was in his pocket, and he clutched it tightly, trying not to look in the rearview mirror. The dark and silent road only heightened his anxiety, and he whispered a quiet prayer for protection. Although he didn't see anything directly, the feeling that something was there with him was undeniable, and Jacob spent the rest of the drive with his heart racing. What disturbed him the most was the fact that Mr. Bruno seemed completely at peace with it all. The man dealt with the paranormal as if it were a normal part of his life, which only added to the mystery surrounding him. Jacob wondered how many other people had gone through similar experiences, and how many of them had also received that type of protection from Mr. Bruno. Was it a blessing or a curse? Jacob knew that the object he carried with him represented more than just a simple piece of fabric. It was a symbol of something greater, something he didn't yet fully understand. But above all, it was a constant reminder that the world he knew was filled with things he couldn't explain. And, it seemed, Mr. Bruno was deeply involved in that mysterious world. Sarah, one of the bar's oldest workers, also had a disturbing story to tell about Mr. Bruno. Like many others, she had heard the rumors about Mr. Bruno's supposed pact, but until that moment, she had never paid much attention to them. However, one night, she went through something that would forever change her view of the man. Sarah was known for being skeptical about the supernatural, but her experience left her marked. She told Jacob that, on a particularly quiet night, Mr. Bruno invited her to leave the bar and spend the night at his farm. Sarah, already familiar with Mr. Bruno, accepted the offer without hesitation, as he had always been kind and had never mistreated her. During the trip to the farm, Sarah noticed that Mr. Bruno's behavior was stranger than usual. He was quiet, staring intently at the road, as if he were waiting for something. Like Jacob, Sarah began to feel a strange presence during the ride. At first she heard noises coming from outside the truck, like someone running alongside the vehicle. Frightened, she mentioned it to Mr. Bruno, but he simply told her to ignore it. However, the feeling of being watched was too intense to ignore, and Sarah began to feel uncomfortable in Mr. Bruno's presence, who until then had seemed harmless. When they reached a more isolated part of the road, Sarah saw something that made her scream in fear. A tall, hunched figure was following the car at a terrifying speed. The creature didn't seem fully human, and its silhouette was indistinct, almost as if it were wrapped in shadows. Mr. Bruno, unlike Sarah, showed no fear. He simply said, in a calm and unsettling tone, for her not to look back. It was at that moment Sarah knew something was terribly wrong. The creature followed them for several miles until it finally disappeared from view as they arrived at the farm. Sarah was in shock as she got out of the car, and Mr. Bruno, once again with his unsettling calmness, acted as if nothing had happened. He said goodbye to Sarah, leaving her to return to the bar on her own. Sarah never again accepted an offer from Mr. Bruno to leave the bar, and since that night, she began avoiding any prolonged interaction with him. Sarah's account left Jacob even more disturbed. He knew he wasn't the only one who had experienced something supernatural involving Mr. Bruno, and this made him question even more who or what Mr. Bruno really was. Whatever had been following those people on the road seemed directly linked to the man everyone believed had made a pact with the unknown. Despite all the strange stories and events, Mr. Bruno never changed his public behavior. He continued to be the same friendly man, always with a smile on his face and a kind word for everyone. This only deepened the mystery around him. How could someone be so calm in the face of such disturbing occurrences? Jacob couldn't understand how Mr. Bruno dealt with the supernatural so nonchalantly. Mr. Bruno seemed to live in two worlds. At the bar, he was the ideal customer, polite, generous, and always willing to chat with others. However, as Jacob and the workers discovered, there was a hidden side to him that no one could fully comprehend. It was almost as if Mr. Bruno were at peace with the supernatural, as if it were part of his daily life. This made him even more frightening, as he seemed to know far more than he revealed. When Jacob directly asked about what he had seen on the road, Mr. Bruno neither confirmed nor denied anything. He simply smiled and said there were things people didn't need to understand. That enigmatic response only increased Jacob's unease, as he felt Mr. Bruno knew more than anyone else about what was happening. The idea that Mr. Bruno was in control of something so powerful was both fascinating and terrifying. The way Mr. Bruno answered Jacob's questions was always ambiguous. He never gave direct answers, which only left Jacob more confused. When Jacob asked about the deformed figure of St. Jude Thaddeus, Mr. Bruno responded calmly, as if it were something common. The ease with which he dealt with the supernatural made it clear that he wasn't an ordinary person. But who, or what, was he? Another curious aspect was that Mr. Bruno never seemed to be physically affected by anything. Even on the coldest nights or after drinking large amounts of alcohol, he remained unfazed, as if he were always in complete control of himself. This, combined with his ability to ignore the fear and panic that surrounded him, made Jacob start to doubt Mr. Bruno's humanity. Over time, Jacob began to fear not only what he saw, but also what Mr. Bruno knew. The man had a presence that caused discomfort, even when he wasn't doing anything overtly threatening. The feeling that something was wrong with Mr. Bruno grew with each encounter, and Jacob knew that no matter how hard he tried, he would never be able to uncover the truth about this enigmatic man. In one of the most intriguing moments of their conversations, Mr. Bruno referred to the entity Jacob had seen on the road as his guardian angel. This revelation shook Jacob deeply, as he had never associated that grotesque creature with something that could be called an angel. In Jacob's mind, angels were figures of light, benign protectors. However, what he had seen was a deformed figure, terrifying and full of malice. Mr. Bruno seemed calm when talking about his guardian angel, as if he were talking about an old friend. To him, that entity was something natural, part of his daily life. What left Jacob even more perplexed was the almost affectionate tone Mr. Bruno used to describe the creature. He didn't seem to fear the entity, but rather respected it, as if it were a valuable, though terrifying, protection. Jacob couldn't understand how anyone could live with such a creature by their side all the time. The fact that Mr. Bruno said the entity never left him was frightening. How was it possible to live in peace, knowing that such a monstrous being was constantly nearby? For Jacob, the idea was unbearable, but Mr. Bruno seemed to have made peace with this reality long ago. When Jacob asked why he had been able to see Mr. Bruno's guardian angel, while Emily hadn't seen anything, Mr. Bruno gave a vague response. He suggested that some people were simply more receptive to that kind of vision, while others weren't. This made Jacob feel even more vulnerable. The possibility that the entity could choose him to manifest itself left him uneasy and unable to relax. Jacob tried several times to push the memory of the figure out of his mind, but the idea that it was an angel deeply disturbed him. He wondered if Mr. Bruno truly believed he was being protected by that creature, or if deep down he knew he was trapped by something far darker. Regardless, Mr. Bruno seemed to accept this reality calmly, which only deepened the mystery surrounding him. The notion that Mr. Bruno's guardian angel could appear at any moment continued to haunt Jacob. He didn't want to see that figure again, but he knew that as long as he was connected to Mr. Bruno, the possibility would always exist. This thought kept him in a constant state of alert, unable to feel completely safe, even in his own home. Over the years, Jacob began to realize that, although many knew Mr. Bruno, no one really knew who he was. The man was a familiar figure at the bar and in the town, but his personal life was a complete mystery. The stories that arose about him were always full of gaps, and no one could trace a clear line regarding his past or his family. He seemed to be a solitary figure, surrounded by wealth and secrets. The rumors about Mr. Bruno's pact never disappeared. In fact, they only intensified over time. Some people said he had made a pact for power and fortune, while others believed he had sold his soul in exchange for longevity. The fact was that no one knew for sure, but everyone agreed that there was something abnormal about Mr. Bruno. His presence, although friendly, carried a weight that made everyone around him uncomfortable. After his experiences with Mr. Bruno, Jacob began to reflect on what was really happening. What he had seen on the road and what Sarah and others had experienced couldn't be explained by rational means. There was something supernatural surrounding Mr. Bruno, but Jacob still didn't know if it was a curse or some sort of sinister protection. The fact that Mr. Bruno was always calm and in control only made the situation more disturbing. Over time, Jacob began to avoid talking about Mr. Bruno. He feared that by mentioning his name or the experiences he had, he might attract unwanted attention from the entity that followed the man. He knew that as long as he continued working at the bar, there was a possibility of crossing paths with Mr. Bruno again, but each time that happened, Jacob felt a chill run down his spine. Mr. Bruno, on the other hand, continued to live his life normally. He frequented the bar, chatted with the workers, and occasionally asked Jacob to take him back to the farm. Even though Jacob tried to avoid those rides, it was hard to escape, as Mr. Bruno always seemed to know when it was Jacob's turn. The trips to the farm became increasingly tense, and Jacob could never shake the feeling that he was being watched the entire way. In the end, Jacob came to the conclusion that he would never fully uncover the truth about Mr. Bruno. The man was an enigma, a mystery he would never be able to completely solve. All that was left for Jacob was to accept that some things in the world are beyond human understanding, and Mr. Bruno, with his guardian angel, was certainly one of those things.